covering the stories that impact your life, your town, your state, and your future. This is the Means Report with your host, Brad Means.
Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the Means Report. We appreciate you spending part of your day with us. You know, the last few weeks on the Means Report, we focused on politics. We've had a lot of the politicians themselves in here, as Richmond and Aiken County have seen some heated races. Well, now that season is kind of paused for a while locally, and we can turn our attention to the national political scene. The presidential race will certainly dominate our time today, see where things stand with Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And then, as always, we'll wrap up the Means Report with ways that you can stay in touch. And we are so pleased to welcome back Dr. Mary Kate Lizotte. She's a political scientist, works in the Department of Social Sciences as a professor at Augusta University. And Mary Kate, thanks for taking the time to come back. And I hope I waited long enough, because we really put you through the ringer the last political cycle, right?
Right. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's nice to be back. It's been a while.
It has, and I appreciate your expertise. You know, I was looking at the calendar when it comes to the presidential race and see that we're now just days away as we tape this edition from a debate. And so I want to ask you a few questions about that. First of all, just let's look at presidential debates in general. Does somebody watch those and then walk away and say, okay, good, now I know how to vote because of what I just saw? Does it sway people?
Well, yes and no. So no meaning the people who are watching the debate, who are political junkies or really interested, they're already rooting for a candidate, and that's why they're watching. But the media coverage post-debate, especially if there's sort of a consensus that one candidate won, that can really sway people. And seeing, you know, the little bites from the debate can really help people to make up their mind if they're undecided. But the undecideds are unlikely, especially in June, to watch a debate.
Yeah. How do you win? Is it he or she who has the most zingers, sound bites, as you mentioned, or perhaps the other person crumbling, or both?
I think it's a little bit of both, but also it's really important to think about how they manage expectations. And we see a lot of that, right? Where candidates will say, you know, Biden doesn't have that much time to prep, or, you know, Trump was really busy with his court appearances. And so, you know, they try to manage and lower expectations. And so if they exceed expectations, that tends to be how they end up convincing the media that they've won.
This one is a little bit different. This debate has muted microphones when it's not your turn to talk. So if you want to deliver a zinger or a memorable soundbite, you can't if it's not your turn. No audience, which I think will be kind of eerily quiet, no reaction to anything that either candidate says. What do you think about that format?
Well, in terms of no audience, I think it's really great, because there's actually political science research that shows that people have a completely different perception of how the candidates are doing if there's audience reactions than if there aren't.
Definitely.
So, yeah, I mean, if people are cheering or booing, it can really take away from the message, right, and what the answers actually are. So I think that that's really great. People are going to have a more clear view of where the candidates stand and not be influenced by, you know, the laugh track kind of thing.
Yeah.
In terms of the muted microphone, I think it's going to be difficult for both candidates, probably for Trump more so. It'll be interesting to see whether or not the other mic picks up any of the, you know, person who's muted. That will be really, really interesting to see whether or not it's truly muted or not.
That's a great point. And that's someone who obviously knows how television works, Dr. Lizotte, because if Donald Trump, for instance, yells loud enough, I don't know if they've made a microphone today that could block that.
No,
yeah.
I don't think so.
we can still hear it off to the side. And so that will be an interesting sort of side part of the debate to watch. All right, so what might these folks be debating about as we transition into the issues part of our conversation? What topics do you think are going to dominate presidential politics going forward? Start with abortion. The Supreme Court has wrestled with that. States, including Georgia and South Carolina, are as well. Do you think that'll dominate the conversation once again?
I think that it'll definitely be a part of the debate and a part of the national conversation. We've seen polling that shows that people are having conversations about this topic, that they're learning a lot more about abortion, about the varied reasons why women might have abortions, and the candidates are very different on that issue. It's really interesting, though, not everybody understands that. Not everybody understands that it was the Supreme Court and Biden couldn't stop them in terms of overturning Roe. A lot of people think that Trump is a little bit more middle ground than he actually is. Leaving it up to the states sounds like a middle ground position, but with what some of the states are doing and the fact that Republicans in Congress haven't been willing to pass legislation that protects contraception or IVF, that makes it sound like the Republican Party isn't so middle ground when it comes to abortion.
So are we wrong when we perceive the president as being someone who can influence law when it comes to abortion or policy when it comes to abortion? Because as you mentioned, Congress has so much to do with it. The Supreme Court has so much to do with it. Are we giving the president too much credit in that area?
We tend to do that on most issues.
Yeah.
So the president, because of Congress, doesn't have as much power as we tend to think. In other forms of democracy, like a parliamentary form, the executive is part of the legislative, the prime minister is part of the legislative branch, and so they tend to have a lot more power to influence the agenda, to present their agenda, to pursue it. And the president is really just looking for allies in Congress to pursue it. And if you have divided government like we have now, where the House is majority Republican, then it makes it really difficult for the president to get things done.
All right, so continuing with this perception that the president gets too much credit or we put too much power, we perceive him as having too much power. What about when it comes to the economy? So the first question in that regard is, will that be a big part of the conversation going forward, do you think?
I think so, especially inflation, especially cost of living. Those are still big concerns when we look at polling. People are still really struggling. Inflation has improved. It's been improving for a while now, but people are still, feeling like groceries cost too much and, the necessities cost too much. So I think that that's a big concern. And people think back to the Trump administration and think about how prices were lower. And, that is definitely something that helps Trump. I think it's unfortunate that people don't realize how little the president has to do with that sort of thing.
Yeah. Can the party, can the Democrats, for instance, to give themselves a little nudge in the polls or at the precincts come Election Day, do anything to impact inflation in the coming months to make it cheaper to fill up our car or go to the grocery store, and then we get this good feeling and go, oh, they're doing great, let's reelect them?
So in terms of gas prices, yes, they could get rid of some of the taxes that are on gas prices, so that will lower the cost. I think that one thing that the Democrats would love to do if they had a majority is to go after price gouging. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely a big part of it. It's been a while since the pandemic. It's not just supply chains anymore. It's not, the checks that people receive from the government that is causing inflation. A lot of it's price gouging. And so the Democratic Party definitely would love to go after corporations that are engaging in that. But, without a majority, it's difficult to do.
All right, you said pandemic. It made me think of bird flu because it was somewhere on my Twitter or Facebook feed recently. Should we fear another pandemic as November approaches, or do you think we'll stay pretty normal? And it may be unanswerable, but I just saw that and it made me sort of panic.
Right. I doubt that we'll see another pandemic come November, but I do think that it's important to consider how much a president can influence, an administration can influence our readiness. So if you look at the history of our readiness for a pandemic or for a big unexpected flu outbreak, we weren't as ready as we should have been in the Trump term. And so I think that that is an important issue to think about, whether or not the Biden administration or the Trump administration is going to be best prepared and make sure that we're ready to deal with something like that.
Let's talk about immigration. Do you think that'll be a big deal, securing the border? Both presidents, Trump during his time certainly, and now recently even President Biden, have made that a focal point. Is that a big deal with voters, I guess is the easiest way to ask?
I think that it is. I think that immigration and border security are kind of different.
Okay.
So when it comes to polling on immigration, a lot of Americans actually support having a path to citizenship, helping people who've been here for a long period of time, who have family ties here, getting to that path to citizenship. When it comes to border security, I think that's a little bit different. We're seeing some, negative impacts in cities with an influx of immigrants and some concerns about the ability of the bureaucrats at the border to handle the huge influx that we've seen, which is really what the Biden administration, in terms of border security, has been pushing, is this idea that we need more manpower to just deal with that influx. We just don't have enough, feet on the ground to deal with it. And so I think that that's a real difference between the Trump and the Biden campaign, where Trump would probably pursue what he pursued during his administration earlier, which is to separate families, to deport a lot of individuals. And that's obviously very different. So it's an interesting difference between the two candidates, for sure.
Real quickly before we head to break, do you think foreign policy is going to be a big deal with voters? What the U.S.'s role is on the world stage? Is that something we think about when we pick a candidate?
So foreign policy doesn't end up being a top of mind issue unless it's in the middle of a war, and then people tend to be concerned about it. But otherwise, foreign policy isn't a concern for most voters. It's really domestic issues that are top of mind. And so it's interesting, though, because foreign policy is actually one of the areas that the president has the most leeway, has the most authority. And so it's kind of strange that that's not a big topic on people's minds.
We're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Mary Kate Lizotte, political scientist in the Department of Social Sciences at Augusta University. We'll talk about the age of these gentlemen, should that concern us. We'll also take a look at the legal system issues facing Donald Trump, talking politics on this edition of the Means Report. Welcome back to the Means Report. We are talking about politics, especially the presidential race. Just a few months left until we go to the polls in November and either re-elect President Biden or, as it looks at this point, elect Donald Trump and re-elect him from his last term. We'll see what happens there. But let's talk about all of the issues that are coming into play with Dr. Mary Kate Lizotte. She is our political expert who just appears on the Means Report, it seems like every other edition whenever there's a big race going on. And so we do lean on you, and we'll lean on you some more today for sure. Let's look at Joe Biden's age. He's 81, Donald Trump is 78. Do you think voters care about that when they're making their choice, or do they just wish we had two other people running?
I think that they do care. I would say that conservative news outlets and Trump has been very successful with the narrative that Biden is too old and he's not fit. I wonder to what extent that's actually accurate. We saw his State of the Union address. He seemed like he knew what he was doing. So I think that the debate is really going to be difficult for him because he does have a stammer and he does have a tendency to start to talk and then think, oh no, I want to go in a different direction. And so he'll start a sentence and then start a new sentence. And that makes it seem like, he's not on top of things, that he's not all there. And so I think probably with campaign prep for the debate, they're probably going to focus a lot on that. To what extent he plays into that existing narrative that he's too old and that he's not all there, it could definitely continue to be a problem for him.
I know that you've cautioned us before about believing everything you see on the news and on social media, and your colleagues at AU have done the same. And so when it comes to the public perception that Joe Biden isn't all there or that he's having issues, and they show a video on Twitter that appears to show him freeze on a stage, is that just people manipulating that video? Whereas if you watched the whole clip, you would see that he didn't freeze. He was just stopping to wave at somebody or do something like that. Is that a good way to look at it?
I think sometimes those videos are manipulated. They're taken out of context. They don't show the full context. They don't show what was actually happening, that he was freezing because someone, interrupted with a question, or that he's not actually wandering off, he's going to shake someone's hand, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think, it's easy to do. It's easy for both sides to do, to show Trump talking in a way that doesn't make complete sense, or maybe he misspeaks. People do that, right? We all misspeak at some point or another, but if you selectively choose clips and don't show the full context, it can make someone look like they're not as intelligent or as with it as they actually are.
You're right, because if you dig deep enough, you can find like the full video of Trump or Biden on that same stage, and it gives you a whole different look than that little Twitter post that you saw. What about Donald Trump and his legal problems? We have seen him recently get convicted. He has, I think, at least 3 more potential trials to face. What in the world is going on, and just your overall thoughts on how that affects the race?
Right. This is the first time that a former president has become a convicted felon. And that is a pretty big deal. In terms of if he was to be elected president again, he wouldn't be allowed to visit some countries who don't allow felons to visit, or a special exception would need to be made. He does have these other trials coming. They're not going to happen before the election, so that's of interest. I think those other trials interest people because of the concern that another January 6th could happen, that if Trump was to be reelected, there's a possibility that he wouldn't want to leave again. And so in that way, I think the fact that he's already a convicted felon, the fact that he's a convicted felon for trying to influence an election, definitely raises some concerns about whether or not he would continue in the history of our democratic institutions and leave once his 4 years were up.
Okay, you mentioned the other cases that he's dealing with probably won't come into play before November, but the conviction in the business fraud trial that he just faced in New York, is that something that could land him in jail? So
it's unlikely, given that he does not have a record, and because of who he is. But if you look at other similar business fraud cases involving a similar amount of money that have happened in that court previously, some of those individuals who've been convicted have gone to prison. And so it is a possibility. It's, I think, improbable, but definitely still possible that he might go to prison.
Could he be elected president in jail? The internet tells me that he could, probably. Is that possible, or do you just say, okay, no, he's in jail, you may not vote for him now? It's not how it works, is it?
Well, he probably won't serve any time until his appeals have been exhausted. And so it's not as if he would, be in prison on election day. As a convicted felon, he can still run and still be elected.
Am I looking at this wrong? Not me, Brad Means, but me, the person who's trying to ask you every question I can think of. When I say, look, it's Joe Biden's Department of Justice, Joe Biden could say something or do something and make these folks back off of the other nominee. I've never seen such as, and I'd feel the same way, or I'd ask you the same question if it was reversed. But isn't this just incredibly odd and, as you mentioned, unprecedented to see the guy's main challenger facing legal problems every day?
Yeah, it is very odd. When it comes to the business fraud case, the Department of Justice had nothing to do with that.
That was a state thing?
Yes.
Okay.
So Biden wouldn't be able to interfere. But in general, Biden has agreed with precedent that he doesn't interfere at all with the Department of Justice. And so, we've seen Hunter Biden facing federal crime allegations and court trials. And so I think that if he was going to interfere, it probably would be on many counts in terms of helping his son, as well as going after his opposition. I think it's unfortunate that Americans view this as a political phenomenon. It's really a law and order phenomenon. I don't think that Biden is telling Merrick Garland, who is the most middle ground head of Department of Justice that you could find to do these sorts of things. And I don't think that Merrick Garland would stand for that, given his reputation and his past.
Do you think that all of these troubles that we've talked about will help Donald Trump? And I know it's early, just a few days, couple weeks since his conviction in New York. Are they giving him a boost, or will they, the more that the more trouble he faces?
No, it definitely isn't going to help him.
Okay.
I think we've seen it not hurt him that much up until this point, and that is definitely interesting. I don't think that there's any world in which being a convicted felon is going to help him, but he's been able to create a narrative for his campaign that it is political, that there's no merit to these cases, and I think in that way it hasn't hurt him. It remains to be seen, though, if it will hurt him with independents, with swing voters who aren't really a fan of either candidate and are still mulling it over. Perhaps for some of those individuals, this will be the nail in the coffin for Trump, and they'll end up turning out to vote for Biden. I've
asked a lot of people this, the Secretary of State, the governor of Georgia. I'll ask you, can we trust our election system? So much of what happened on January 6th was because people didn't, and they didn't believe the outcome. What do you think? When we cast our ballot, is it secure?
It's definitely secure. We do not have to worry about that at all. I would say the only thing related to elections that we have to worry about is interference from foreign governments when it comes to social media.
Yeah.
So the social media leading up to the 2016 and the 2020 election, we saw a lot of Russian bots and other foreign governments trying to convince people to stay at home or who to vote for, and they weren't real accounts. And social media really needs to crack down on those things. Those companies really need to make it so that you can't just create all of these fake accounts and push people to stay at home or to vote for the other guy. Mm-hmm. That's really the concern. When it comes to actually casting your ballot, we don't have to be worried about that.
Probably my last question, and it just plays off of something you said earlier accurately when you said our government is divided. Do you still feel like our nation is divided? And if so, is there anything we can do to diminish that, to make us be more together and less divided?
Well, I would say in a way we've been divided from the get-go, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we look at the framers of the Constitution, there were the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. And there's always been two or more sides to every single issue that this country's faced. And so in a way, we'll always be divided. I think that there's a lot, though, that we have in common. I mean, we tend to focus on our differences, but a majority of Americans want health care for everyone, however that works. A majority of Americans, want cost of living to be manageable. They want a living wage, all of these sorts of things that we agree on. And it's unfortunate that with a two-party system like we have, that we end up focusing on those divisions instead of focusing on the bipartisan opportunities to collaborate and, get things done that the majority of American people want.
Well, our time is up. It has flown by, but I feel smarter now and better informed, and I'm sure you all do as we prepare to go to the polls in a few short months. Mary Kate Lizotte, thank you for your expertise and insight. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We will have Dr. Mary Kate Lizotte back very soon. Hope she keeps saying yes to us at the Means Report. When we come back, how you can help us get more great guests like Dr. Lizotte. It's easy. We'll show you when we come back.